A skull twice the length of yours. Buried in the driest desert on Earth for 3,000 years. And when scientists finally ran the DNA, the internet exploded with claims that it wasn't fully human. Here's the problem: most of what you've heard about that test is not what actually happened. Today we are going back through the real science, the real archaeology, and the real story of the Paracas skulls, so you know exactly what the evidence shows and what it doesn't. 030. In 1928, a Peruvian archaeologist named Julio Tello was digging on the Paracas Peninsula, a strip of coastal desert south of Lima, so dry that almost nothing decomposes there. What he found changed the way we understand ancient Peru. Beneath the sand were hundreds of burials, wrapped in layers of woven textiles so fine that some are still considered among the best preserved fabrics in the ancient world. Alongside the bodies were gold ornaments, ceramic vessels, obsidian tools, and feathered headdresses. This was clearly not an ordinary burial ground. It was a cemetery for an elite class, people whose community had the resources and the belief system to send them into the afterlife surrounded by wealth. And then there were the skulls. Many of the individuals in these tombs had heads that were dramatically stretched and elongated, some far beyond what most people have ever seen in a human skeleton. It's a striking image, and it's easy to understand why it stuck in the public imagination for almost a century. 115. So what actually causes a skull to look like this? The scientific explanation is called artificial cranial deformation, and it is extremely well documented, not just in Peru, but around the world. An infant's skull is soft and still forming for the first year or two of life. If you apply steady, gentle pressure during that window, using cloth wrappings, flat boards, or tightly wound bands, the bone plates will grow into the shape that pressure creates. This was practiced by the Maya in Mesoamerica, by nomadic groups across Central Asia, by communities in parts of Africa, France, and the Pacific Islands. In many of these cultures, an elongated or flattened head wasn't a defect. It was a mark of beauty, status, or belonging to a particular family line. Parents did this on purpose, because a distinctive head shape told everyone in the community who you were. The Paracas elite appear to have taken this practice further than most cultures on record. Some of their skulls show elongation that is more extreme than the classic examples from Central Asia or Mesoamerica. But more extreme doesn't mean a different mechanism. Physical anthropologists who have studied cranial deformation for decades point out that binding pressure applied consistently over a longer developmental window, or with stiffer materials, produces more dramatic results. Extreme elongation is still elongation. It's still bone responding to sustained external force, not a different species, or a different origin. 230. This is where a lot of online content starts making claims that go well beyond what any peer-reviewed study has actually found. You may have seen videos claiming that certain Paracas skulls have a cranial volume 25% larger than a normal human skull, that the bone is unusually heavy and dense, and that some skulls are missing the sagittal suture, the seam that runs along the top of the skull where the two parietal bones meet. These claims trace back almost entirely to one source, a self-published researcher and tour guide named Brian Foster, who has promoted these ideas since around 2014, along with a handful of similar YouTube channels that have repeated his numbers ever since. None of those specific measurements, the 25% volume increase, the missing suture, the unusual bone density, have been published in a peer-reviewed anatomical journal, verified by an independent physical anthropologist, or replicated by any accredited laboratory. When actual bioarchaeologists have examined Paracas skulls in museum collections, including researchers affiliated with Peru's ICA Regional Museum and international academic partners, they describe skull shapes and sutures consistent with known deformation practices, not with an unexplained biological anomaly. It's worth being precise about this distinction, because the difference between a popular YouTube claim and a scientific finding is exactly where this story tends to get distorted. 4 o'clock. Now, the DNA. This is the part of the story that gets repeated the most, and it deserves the most scrutiny, because it involves real science being used in a very unusual way. In 2014, Brian Foster arranged for hair samples from several Paracas skulls to be sent to a genetics lab in Texas for testing. The lab, which was not an ancient DNA specialist facility and had no publication history in archaeogenetics, reportedly told him that some samples showed mitochondrial DNA mutations that didn't match known Native American haplogroups, and speculated informally about possible links to European or Central Asian populations. This result was never published in a scientific journal. It was never subjected to peer review. It was never independently replicated by a laboratory that specializes in ancient DNA, where contamination control is the single hardest and most important part of the process. Ancient hair and bone are extraordinarily easy to contaminate with modern human DNA from anyone who has ever touched them: museum staff, tourists, previous researchers. And a lab without ancient DNA protocols is exactly the kind of setting where that kind of contamination happens. This matters enormously, because real, peer-reviewed ancient DNA research on Andean populations does exist, and it tells a very different, and much better supported story. Studies published by geneticists including Lars Fahrenschmitz and colleagues, using next-generation sequencing on ancient Peruvian and broader South American remains, have consistently found genetic continuity with the same founding populations that crossed from Asia into the Americas via Beringia thousands of years before Paracas culture existed. These are large, replicated, peer-reviewed datasets, built with the strict contamination protocols that any credible ancient DNA lab uses. They do not show European, Middle Eastern, or Caucasus region genetic signatures showing up in Peru 3,000 years before European contact. So when you compare the two things side by side, an informal, unpublished, unreplicated result from a single sample sent to a non-specialist lab in 2014 versus decades of published, peer-reviewed genomic research on ancient South Americans, it's clear which one deserves more weight. The Paracas claim was never subjected to the kind of scrutiny that would let anyone responsibly say what it means. It was reported once, informally, and then spread widely online precisely because it sounded dramatic. 6:30. That doesn't mean there's nothing left to be curious about. The Paracas culture is genuinely remarkable, and you don't need unverified DNA claims to make that case. This was a Pacific coastal society that flourished from roughly 800 BCE to 100 BCE, centuries before the Inca Empire existed, and it produced some of the most technically accomplished textile work anywhere in the ancient world. Weavers used dozens of natural dye colors and complex embroidery techniques that took specialists months to complete for a single burial garment. The scale of some of these burial bundles, over 100 garments wrapped around a single individual, tells us this was a society with a highly organized division of labor, long-distance trade networks for dyes and fibers, and a belief system that placed enormous importance on how the dead were prepared for whatever came next. The elongated skulls fit naturally into that picture. If cranial shaping was reserved mostly for the elite burials Tello found, it was very likely functioning the same way it did in other cultures that practiced it, as a lifelong, visible marker of status, assigned to a person as an infant, long before they had any say in the matter. That's not a smaller or less interesting story than an ancient alien or lost civilization narrative. It's a real window into how a Bronze Age-era society used the human body itself to encode who belonged to its ruling class. 8 o'clock. Why has this particular case become such fertile ground for extraordinary claims? Partly because the visual is genuinely startling. An elongated skull just looks unlike anything most viewers have encountered, and that reaction is a great hook for online content. Partly because official science is hiding the truth is one of the most reliably engaging narratives on the internet, whether or not there's an actual cover-up involved. And partly because ancient DNA science is complicated enough, and moves fast enough, that a single informal claim from 2014 can circulate for over a decade without most viewers ever hearing about the peer-reviewed research that actually addresses the same question. It's also true that mainstream archaeology and genetics are, by design, slow and conservative. Extraordinary claims are supposed to require extraordinary, replicated evidence before they are accepted, and that process can look to outsiders like institutions ignoring or suppressing an inconvenient result. But in this case, the more accurate description isn't suppression, it's that the original claim was never brought through the process that would let scientists evaluate it in the first place. No sample chain of custody was published. No lab methodology was published. No peer review ever happened. There's nothing to suppress, because there was never a completed scientific study to begin with. 930. So where does that leave the actual mystery of the Paracas skulls? It leaves us with a culture that is still, genuinely, not fully understood, just not for the reasons that spread the fastest online. We don't know exactly why Paracas elites elongated their skulls more dramatically than most other cultures that practiced the same technique. We don't know exactly how their social and religious systems worked, since the Paracas left no written language behind, only textiles, pottery, and burials for us to interpret. We don't have anywhere near enough well-documented ancient DNA from Paracas burials specifically, sequenced with modern, peer-reviewed methods, to say anything definitive about the deeper ancestry of this particular population beyond what we already know about the broader peopling of the Americas. That's actually where new, legitimate research could make a real difference. Modern ancient DNA sequencing is dramatically more sensitive and more resistant to contamination than what was available even 10 years ago. If Peruvian institutions and international genetics labs partnered to run a properly designed, peer-reviewed study on verified Paracas remains, with published methodology, published chain of custody, and independent replication, that would be a real scientific event, not a rumor. It's the kind of study that could confirm the expected pattern of Native American ancestry, or, if the evidence genuinely supported something unexpected, force the field to take a hard second look. Either outcome would be worth having actual answers to, instead of a decade-old, unpublished claim standing in for one. 11 o'clock. The elongated skulls of Paracas are real. The wealth in those tombs is real. The extraordinary artistry of their textiles is real. What has never been demonstrated, in any peer-reviewed, independently verified way, is that these people were biologically different from other ancient Americans, or that their DNA points to an impossible transoceanic migration thousands of years before Columbus. The honest version of this story is still remarkable. A Bronze Age coastal culture in Peru that used cranial shaping, elaborate burial customs, and extraordinary craftsmanship to mark out its most powerful members, and left behind evidence sophisticated enough that we are still learning from it 3,000 years later. That's the story worth telling. Not because it's less exciting than the alternative, but because it's the one the evidence actually supports, and because getting it right is the only way we'll ever know if there's something even more surprising still waiting to be found.